Medicine evolves one story at a time. Here's one worth telling. This is History Taking. Hey everyone, today I wanted to talk about the heroes and legends of medicines and the story that made them. And today I thought we'd start with Florence Nightingale. So to do that, we got to go back to the Crimean War. We have Britain, France, Ottoman Empire versus Russia. This was largely fought on the Crimean Peninsula, which is essentially modern-day Ukraine. By February of 1855, the mortality rate at Scutari Hospital had reached 42.7% of all cases that were treated. And Florence Nightingale arrives with 38 nurses, a lamp, and a notebook, and she's about to discover something about why these men are dying in a way that is too big to count, and she's going to build an entirely new science in order to prove it. When she arrived, she saw wounds, the cold, the wartime, so obviously that's why the soldiers are dying, right? She initially blamed this high death toll on inadequate nutrition, and the building itself was actually sat on top of a damaged sewer, but no one had checked that. But Nightingale decides to go ahead and start counting, systematically and obsessively. She compiled detailed records to chronicle the problems and the causes of death, and upon her return in 1856, she continued to track data and collect these statistics from the British hospitals. And what the numbers showed actually suggested that disease was the killer, not wounds. Disease alone at its peak rate would have wiped out the entire British army in Crimea if the dead hadn't been replaced. Preventable infectious disease like cholera, dysentery, typhus overwhelmingly dominated the mortality data versus battle wounds and other causes. And so when she went to statistician William Farr, who helped her analyze the data, she fully realized how many more lives would have been saved if they had a greater focus on basic sanitation. Which is ironic because these patients were going to the hospital to get better, but the hospital wasn't appropriately sanitized. So it wasn't that war was deadly, it's that the hospital was deadly because of that lack of sanitation. Back in the 1850s, medicine didn't think about population. There was no infrastructure to really gather that data or do that analysis. Instead, they thought about miasma theory, the idea that illness comes from bad air and not necessarily traceable environmental causes. England's chief medical officer, John Simon, even asserted that, quote, the great mortality from important classes of zymotic, aka infectious, disease is practically unavoidable. If you got an infection, good luck and goodbye. Army officials and administrators resisted. They attributed the deaths to the hospital, but the concern about this was that some others pushed back, saying that you're accusing this helpful institution. MPs and army officials held this entrenched belief that soldiers would die from their wounds and didn't want to blame the unsanitary hospitals for that. And so even though the data might have suggested this, there were no real tools to communicate that issue. And if there's no tools to communicate the issue, the will to act on this didn't exist at all. So Nightingale understood that these tables of numbers are not going to shift Parliament in any meaningful way. And so she thought, rather than provide this data like a statistician would with a table and a bunch of numbers, she wanted to visualize the information. She sees the power of graphics to communicate the statistical findings to a readership that weren't specialists in mathematics or statistics. So she comes up with the coxcomb diagram, or the polar area diagram. So here's how that works. The chart itself is divided into 12 equal slices, and each slice represented 1 month each year. The shaded area of each slice extended radially from the center, hence the polar area, and that shaded area is proportional to the death rate of that month. The color coding of the shades indicated the cause. Blue represented preventable death, red represented the wounds, and black represented other. The key distinction from a pie chart is that in a pie chart, each size of the slice represents a proportion, but in a coxcomb, it's the length of how that slice extends from the center that represents the value. So you can see complex layered timeline-based information in a single space. She had actually tried something differently before, so she called it the bat's wing. She had used the length of all radial lines to represent the variation in death rates, but in the final coxcomb, she switched to using area instead, which allowed for a more mathematically accurate and visually representative description. And the results were that the blue wedges that represented death by sickness were far bigger than those representing wounds across the year. The message was twofold. Most fatalities were from sickness, and improvements in hygiene dramatically reduced the death rate. She printed 2,000 copies of these diagrams and circulated them to the royal family and to government officials. And these visualizations were designed beyond traditional descriptive tables. They were built to indicate the necessity of healthcare reform. So she had the weapon in the chart, but next up is the infrastructure. Each hospital used its own nomenclature and classification of diseases, making it impossible to compare statistics from one hospital to another. With Farr and other physicians, she standardized this list of diseases and created a set of hospital forms for data gathering. In 1859, she persuaded a few London hospitals to use these forms on a trial basis, and these forms became the foundation for today's hospital statistics standards. After the International Statistical Congress held in London in 18 endorsed her plans, she actually convinced London and Parisian officials to comply. The results were compiled in the Journal of the Statistical Society of London. In 8, Farr nominated Nightingale as the first woman elected Fellow of the Statistical Society of London. She emphasized that each hospital keep a patient records database detailing all medical information pertinent to care, essentially inventing the medical record as a standardized tool. Of course, it isn't that simple. The story is going to get complicated because it always does. In March of 1805, the Sanitary Commission was sent to Crimea, and they unclogged the drains, removed debris from water pipes, installed windows and vents, and washed the walls with lime, and mortality rates dropped from 52% before the Commission's arrival to 20% afterwards. And the death rate only dropped after the Sanitary Commission repaired the sewers and improved ventilation. But the uncomfortable question is, who is to get the credit? Is Nightingale the one to save these soldiers, or was it the commission that did it? Nightingale initially attributed the high death toll to poor nutrition, suboptimal treatment, and delayed transfer, not sanitation, but it was Farr's analysis done after the war that revealed the truth. MacDonald's scholarship in the collected works of Florence Nightingale argues that the heroic narrative has been overcredited and oversimplified. However, what isn't in dispute is this. She recognized the commission's role, and she actually featured it prominently in her own charts. The two panels of the coxcomb correspond to dates before and after March 1855, and she built the commission's intervention directly into her visualization. She wasn't trying to hide the truth or get unnecessary credit. She was illustrating the work that improved sanitation does to improve death rates overall. By the end of the war, with sanitary reforms in place, the annualized mortality rate had dropped to 13 per 1,000. The peak was at 400 per 1,000. The Nightingale Training School, St. Thomas's Hospital in 1860, was the first secular nursing school in the world. Notes on Hospitals in 1859 opened with the line, quote, "It may seem a strange principle to enunciate as the very first requirement in a hospital that it should do the sick no harm." A century before, first do no harm even became a clinical mantra. Every hospital mortality review, every quality improvement metric, every infection control protocol traces to the idea that you have to count to know. The coxcomb itself is still used. We saw it a lot during COVID with dashboards. We saw it in surgical outcome reporting. Hospital-acquired infection tracking all use the same logic. Make the data undeniable at a glance. Florence Nightingale didn't just tend to the sick. She diagnosed the hospital itself, and she prescribed evidence using epidemiology. And hospitals in the world are safer for it. This has been History Taking. Thanks for listening. Want to talk about the latest episode or give us feedback on how to make the show better? Feel free to reach out on our Discord in the show notes below. Want to send support? Feel free to engage with our Patreon. This is just a passion project for us, but we're always looking for ways to make this better. Thanks for listening.